Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us to our first full day of the Global Democracy Conference. Thanks to all of you who are here in person, and I also want to thank our online audience. And I want to remind our online audience that if they want to submit questions during the panels, they have a box at the bottom of the viewing screen in which they can submit questions, and our staff will do their best to convey the questions to the panels during the question and answer. My name is Aníbal Pérez. I'm director of the Kellogg Institute, and I am delighted to introduce this morning my colleague Jim McAdams in the Department of Political Science, who is going to be the chair of our first panel on understanding international support for anti-democratic movements. Jim, welcome.
Thank you. Is this on? No. It's on? Oh, it's on. Okay. Good morning. I'm Jim McAdams. I've been a fellow of the Kellogg Institute for, back to the dinosaurs, so I'm almost the oldest fellow here. The oldest is the man who brought me here, Scott Mainwaring, whom I can't find right now, but Scott. And so it's delightful to see all of you. These, democracy events, and particularly this conference, are so important to Notre Dame's identity and to the world. As some of you know, I travel frequently to East Central Europe, which I in some ways consider my spiritual home. And one of the most important developments just in the last couple of weeks is the assassination attempt on Robert Fico, Prime Minister of Slovakia. I go to Slovakia a lot. And it's kind of de rigueur to look at an event like this as being purely domestic. But this panel is about importantly, the international element that contributes to what happens domestically. And in the case of Slovakia, you could say, well, there's a lone wolf or more people out there who went after Fico, and the debate now is, are they bad far right, or are they something else? I think they're bad far right, but I'm sure that the Slovaks in power will come to a different conclusion. But when you think about Slovakia, you can't understand it without understanding its neighbors, particularly Mr. Putin in Russia and Mr. Orban in Hungary. Yesterday, in his moving address, Juan Sebastian Chamorro talked with us about the importance of stealth influencers and stealth autocrats. And in this case, both Orban and Putin have intervened in Slovakia's internal affairs by stealth. As Juan Sebastian emphasized yesterday, however, this is by new means. One that we're aware of, but that is much more present than the old autocrats and authoritarians in the military, is economic. Putin has used all kinds of levers to suggest to the Slovaks that he will miraculously save their economy if only they will ally with him. In the case of Hungary, the influence also comes not simply through economic pressures, but through the control of the language of liberal democracy, which, here's an advertisement, is the subject of my new book that was Far-Right Newspeak, which is actually a Kellogg Institute joint project with the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, and which focuses on the hijacking of the language of liberal democracy by the right. But I also want to make another advertisement here, very important for my friend Kurt Weiland. Democracy's resilience. I'm finding all kinds of hopeful people at this conference, which is so good. Hope. But anyway, I highly recommend Democracy's Resilience by Kurt. So today, in our panel, we will be talking about these international influences, and we have a number of not only distinguished, but actually very, very knowledgeable and insightful contributors. I'll go through the names, your names, introduce you. Most of you haven't been to Notre Dame before. Oliver Stuenkel, who's a professor of politics at the Fundação Getulio Vargas in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where Notre Dame has a presence. Stephen Wilson, professor of politics at Brandeis University. María, Isabel Puerta Riera, who's a professor of political science at Valencia College. And Josh Eisenman, who happens to be a colleague and who's familiar with Notre Dame. So we'll start with Oliver and work our way forward. I have assured the contributors, and now I will assure you, that these presentations will be limited to 10 minutes. I'm wishing myself hope and good luck.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you also, Anibal, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. And for somebody who doesn't come to the United States that often, it's always great to actually see the person after having read a lot about, having read their work. So it's really an honor to be part of this discussion here. And I'd like to offer a brief account of let's say, the debate in Brazil, perhaps more broadly in Latin America, about the question of potential pro-autocracy alliances and movements, and how this debate occurs in the global south, which I think is very different from the discussion in the global north, in the United States. And just an initial comment, which I think is always important, is that the narrative of democracy versus autocracy is a uniquely Western one, and it's something that doesn't really occur in Latin America, which is quite interesting because it is the most democratic region in the global south, but let's say there is no natural distinction, which is quite common in the West, between democracies and autocracies. There is no Latin American, as far as I know, list, let's say the democracy rankings, for example, which whenever, this is a Brazilian newspapers frequently translate pieces from the FT and the Washington Post and the Economist into Portuguese, and the reactions tend to be, well, why are they doing this, or what's this distinction all about? And I think that's an important caveat, is that many times U.S. attempts to engage Latin American democracies using a language of the League of Democracies or the Friends of Democracies fail, even though the Latin American counterparts are convinced Democrats. So back in the 90s, for example, Madeleine Albright sought to engage Cardoso, President Cardoso of Brazil, into an initiative of the League of Democracies, and Cardoso declined, which caused some disappointment. And the same occurred now with Biden, where initiatives to rally democracies had only a tepid response. I would say those Latin American countries which joined did so because they opportunistically needed to be close to Biden and had other concerns. It wasn't really about democracy. So I think that's is an important factor to keep in mind as we study pro-autocracy efforts in Latin America, because the mere language of that, if, for example, we had this panel in Brazil, let's say we had a follow-up at Getulio Vargas, I would say, why don't we change the name of the panel to make sure that only a particular, that sort of people more critical of this language will also attend. So I think that's a first issue, and that is because I think the anti-interference intuition is so strong that somebody from the United States speaking about democracies versus autocracies is, by some at least in Latin America, immediately read as a covert attempt to question the sovereignty of countries where democracy is perhaps not as stable as one would like. And the second caveat, which I think is important, is that on numerous accounts which are very fundamental to global order today, there is a huge divergence. So the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, and the rise of China and the resurgence sort of Russia, I would say all of these four issues, which are crucial to making sense of the world, I would say that, let's say, in Brazil and the United States, on all four, there's a complete divergence. When you look at the government's position, that also reflects in academia where, you know, there's a sense that the rise of China is something positive because it allows Brazil to constrain the United States, to balance the United States in Latin America, that the resurgence of Russia also isn't really that bad for Brazil because in a multipolar order, it has better means to contain the United States. And democracy doesn't actually enter much the debate on those fronts. And that, of course, also shapes the way that Latin Americans look at Gaza and Ukraine. I'm not defending the Latin American position. I'm just saying that is an important issue as we discuss the rising threat of pro-autocracy alliances around the world. And that discussion is being made more difficult, I think, in Brazil also, because the challenges facing Brazil's democracy are very diffuse and coming from very different directions. I would say that the biggest one are the armed forces. Is the armed forces of Brazil, again, seeking more political power, fake news, organized crime, I think is a big threat to democracy, but also at times overactive judiciary. So there is no clear distinction, I would say, between sort of pro-democracy actors and pro-autocracy actors, which makes this debate more challenging. And then I also think the threats to democracy come from different sides of the political spectrum. I would say that across Latin America, we do have anti-democratic currents both on the right and the left, and sometimes they're quite similar in a way. And this discussion about Putin, and I'm, let's say, in the ideological spectrum on the war in Ukraine, I'm seen as a rather pro-Ukraine person in Brazil, and the people who attack me are sometimes those on the left who are kind of nostalgic about the Soviet Union and profoundly anti-American, but also people on the right who say, I like Putin because in Russia there's only two genders, right? So these are very weird bedfellows, but who kind of work together on that front, and who also, in that sense, strangely enough, more receptive to potential Russian attempts to influence the public debate. And finally, I'm beginning a research project on especially Russian influence in Latin America, and one of the things we find is that doing this kind of research is, above all, expensive. And that makes it very, very difficult for scholars in the Global South to purchase data on Twitter. It costs more than to employ 3 associate professors for a year. So that's a bit of a challenge. And we're seeing a fragmentation and deinstitutionalization of the public debate in Brazil. Instagram, the worst thing you can be on Instagram is an institution. You want to be an individual, and you know, you talk about politics, and then you take a picture of yourself having breakfast, because that's extremely authentic. So universities, newspapers, television stations, people don't want to know. They want to know about individuals, and that makes researching these things sort of much more difficult. Because as María Isabel is writing about Russia today, etc., these are really important, but they don't give us a sense of the whole picture. We are now beginning to map influencers who question, you know, the rules-based order, who are profoundly anti-American, who are very cynical about democracy, who say that autocracies get things done. But those are sometimes micro-influences, less than 100,000 followers. Some of their videos have 10 million views, so and they're kind of, you know, sometimes TikTok videos, 60 seconds, 10 million views, saying that NATO is forcibly annexing countries in Eastern Europe against the will of the people of Eastern Europe. The Ukrainians didn't want to fight that war, they were forced by NATO to provoke and then confront Russia. So how do you study that? It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of people, and I think we are just at the very beginning of understanding these things, of identifying not causalities, but actually just things that happen at the same time, sort of correlations, but then of course sort of proving that an influencer is receiving money from, let's say, a foreign government is extremely difficult. And that is why I think it's a very opaque debate. And we must be very careful, because after reviewing the literature on pro-autocracy influence in Latin America, a lot of it is based on sort of anecdotes. And that makes these arguments sometimes very vulnerable, because people saying, oh, you're just saying that, you know, the rise of Russia is bad because you're defending US interests. So that's, I think, a challenge. Now, in the, just to finish, in the case of, and I wanted to, for 2 minutes, talk about the case study that I'm looking at in particular, which is how foreign actors are seeking to shape the debate in Latin America about the war in Ukraine. Where what led me to study this is that I, in addition to my work as an academic, I'm a commentator on a news channel. And so sometimes random people say, oh, I saw you, but you're super pro-Ukraine, right? I mean, and I'm like, what makes you say that? And they say, well, you deny that the Ukrainians are a Nazi government committing genocide in eastern Ukraine, and the Russians are liberating them. And I think, where did you hear that? And people say, I don't know, it just sort of circulates on WhatsApp and Telegram. And these aren't political scientists. These are people who just, you know, have other jobs. And I was just so struck, because I had for years, whenever people came to talk about, you know, Russian influence on America, I was like, I think you're exaggerating a bit. This is kind of Cold War talk. And then suddenly, the way that the debate in Brazil happened about the war in Ukraine led me to say, perhaps there's something I'm not seeing. And it is certainly true that Russian diplomacy is much more present in the global south than Ukrainian diplomacy. So Ukraine didn't have an ambassador, for example, in Brazil or most Latin American countries. There is certainly an anti-American sentiment that's fairly easy to mobilize and deploy. And as I said, a deep-seated skepticism vis-a-vis the United States, and a belief that the quote-unquote rules-based order is oftentimes being applied selectively. So all that is fairly easy to utilize, of course. Russia is a profoundly important economic partner. It's a BRICS partner for Brazil. And I think all in all, the West oftentimes when discussing Ukraine has not done enough to sort of explain why this is so important. Whereas from a global south perspective, Russia is far, China is far. They don't really not seen as global security threats, as threats to their national security, and much more as potential partners to contain US influence, which is not necessarily an anti-American argument. I know people who love the United States and Brazil, but they're still keen to contain US influence and are happy to use Putin and Xi Jinping as part of the BRICS grouping to do that. So all in all, I think Russia's attempts to shape Latin American public opinion about the war in Ukraine has been extremely effective, very powerful. I think the dominant understanding in Brazil, at least, vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, is that this is not one country violating the sovereignty of a poor country, but a very complicated war between Russia and NATO. I also think there's a lot of evidence of Russia seeking to kind of pollute the debate with lots of strange arguments which are sort of too weird to be able, there's just too much. You can't rebut all this stuff all the time. So kind of actual researched information gets lost in a sea of just information. That's also anecdotal evidence, and what we need to gain a better understanding of this, as I said, is a lot of research funding. I'm not asking for money here, but I'm just saying the limitations are very important, and we need to now, at least from my perspective when it comes to Brazil, move from a phase of lots of data, interest in, and lots of anecdotal evidence towards actually sorting out the data, analyzing it, and I think that's sort of the next important step to gain a better understanding about this important subject. Thank you.
Remarkable, 10 minutes. Perfect. Stephen.
Thank you very much. And that's actually a perfect lead into what I want to talk about, which is authoritarian disinformation campaigns online. So what are they doing? How are they doing it? Why are they doing it? I'm just going to stand up real quick because I left the remote control they gave me over there.
Do you want me to get the phone?
Oh, great. Okay, that's me. Down here. Okay, so I'm part of a research team, the Digital Society Project. We've got Brigida in the back there. Dan and Valeria couldn't be here today. We're a spin-off a little bit on this of the Varieties of Democracy Institute, which some people are probably a little bit aware of, where we basically take a approach of let's try to measure things cross-nationally by asking people like you who actually know the answers. So expert-coded data. We have a whole suite of different variables. So our initial run was 35 indicators that we asked some 3,000 political scientists around the world using the whole VDEM methodology of lots of stuff that we could ramble on methodologically about IRT theory, Bayesian response, et cetera, et cetera. But the general gist of it is we asked a bunch of experts and can compile for you some good, relatively objective measures of a lot of stuff about the intersection of the internet and politics. Today, I'm just going to be focusing in basically on one or two of those indicators because it's foreign disinformation campaigns. So essentially what we developed here is a 0 to 4 measure where 0 is the worst, 4 is the best, which is a little bit confusing because 0 means most disinformation, where this indicator is basically measuring what is the level of disinformation on social media, foreign source disinformation on political issues on social media in a given country. We produced a nice little ranking of it. We've had this data for, it's panel data from 2000 to the present that we've been doing for 6 years now. We have a second wave that's going to be coming out this summer that is actually dyadic data, which is we're really excited about. But the overall top level thing to look at in this is who's getting hit by disinformation on what level. And these are just some of sort of the top hit countries, which might be, if you know anything about disinformation campaigns, has face validity. Taiwan gets hammered by China, and then there are basically a ton of countries where Russia is hammering. There is a bunch of other ones where the Saudis, UAE, Iran hit various specific countries. But if we want to give an overall summary where red is the worst hit countries all the way up to dark blue is not particularly hit at all, we get this nice perspective of we have a ring around Russia. Russia hammers their entire near abroad, what they consider to be their former or current sphere of influence. There's several other countries that also get hammered by Russia and others. So the United States, of course, gets targeted. But we can pick up some distinct patterns of what's going on here. Can also show you a little bit of face validity sort of over time, where who is getting hit by what over time. So again here, 0 is worst hit, 4 is least hit, and I kind of included a range here so that way it wasn't just the worst hit countries. So down at the bottom, Taiwan's been hammered as long as there's been an internet, and they've been the worst hit. Up top, Norway hasn't been particularly hit early on, but gradually getting worse and worse over time, in particular over the last few national elections. There's been especially Russian inflation of right-wing sentiment online there. The United States, relatively hit at the start, and then in 2014 and then leading up to the 2016 election goes through the roof. Inverted scale, of course. Estonia is interesting because they're one of the earliest super hard hit because of the cyber attacks on them back in 2006, which then kind of recedes into the background, and then they start getting hammered again as Russia ramps up throughout the entire former Soviet world. looking at the countries that are doing it. So we have Sweden on there. All of the VDEM stuff likes to have Sweden on there as the test case of the one where everything is awesome. And you can see there, yeah, Sweden doesn't do this. They do other stuff. They don't do this. The U.S. is a little bad online. They're not. This simply isn't really the U.S. tool that the U.S. uses online. And then you see down at the bottom, China has been a worst offender basically since the dawn of the internet age, and then Russia you see gradually picking up capacity over time as this gets added to the toolkit. Okay, so that's sort of the big picture that's sort of showing us a bunch of stuff that we kind of already knew. What I'd like to show you now is go into a little bit of, okay, but what are they actually doing and why? Okay, because this is actually very nuanced and interesting, as Oliver was referencing. So this is just an example which is sort of not apolitical, but it's not specifically, I'm going to try to rig elections in a democracy sort of thing, right? So when MH17 was shot down over Ukraine back in 2014, Russian disinformation narratives online went into overdrive, mainly because the Russians shot it down, and they didn't want to admit that. But what's really interesting is that the disinformation campaigns were not coherent. Even though they were relatively centrally directed, despite it being non-state actors doing it, there wasn't a central narrative of, oh, the Ukrainians did it or something like that. This is a listing of all of the different narratives that were put out by the same actors at the same time. MH17 was a military transport. It was shot down by Ukraine. It was shot down then by a Ukrainian fighter. It was an attempt to assassinate Putin. Never explained why that was credible. Ukrainian air traffic control diverted the flight. My favorite thing is the actual video evidence and audio evidence given of Carlos, the Spanish air traffic controller, inexplicably, who was working in Kiev's air traffic control center giving testimony that there were actually 2 fighter jets. Then it was the CIA, then it was the Israelis. You don't have disinformation until you get anti-Semitism in there somewhere. Then it was the CIA, and then there was like the real awesome one where MH17 was actually MH370. The CIA killed everybody on board, flew the plane to Belgium, and then rebranded it as a different Malaysian airline and then shot it down. The point is, if you're trying to convince somebody of something, telling them 57 different increasingly implausible lies is not the way to convince them of a particular narrative, right? So, look at a different kind of example. Anti-vaccination sentiment online. So anti-vaccination sentiment in terms of the propaganda online largely comes out of left-wing Americans that are highly educated with too much money and then got super inflated by disinformation campaigns online using existing content. And this, without getting into too much into the super details of it, we can pick up the mechanism where the disinformation actors, as distinguished from those who are misinformation actors, those who are sharing information that's false, but they are genuine about their belief in it, right? So like non-credible actors. What's interesting is that both sides of the argument are inflated. So the Russian botnets are not just pumping up anti-vaccination, they were pumping up both anti-vaccination and pro-vaccination. And then similar to the MH17 case, we would see very, very conflicting things that were put out. So for instance, we have a bunch of evidence from way before COVID of anti-vaccination stuff pushed in particular in Africa. The Russians did not have a vested interest in Africans dying of preventable diseases. It was because pushing anti-Western and anti-elite sentiment had a goal or had a purpose worldwide. When it came to COVID, we saw something similar to the MH17 propaganda, where the disinformation was increasingly incoherent and mutually exclusive. There was no central narrative. It was Gates and Soros. Again, you've got to get the anti-Semitism in there somewhere. It was a CIA bioweapon. It was caused by 5G towers, was an interesting one that a few scholars were able to connect to the fact that there was, at the exact time that there was the rollout going on of the vaccines, was arguments over whether or not Chinese or American companies would get contracts for the 5G towers in Europe. that's interesting. There's suddenly an actual connection point to something besides just blanket anti-Western or anti-democratic sentiment. This stuff actually has an effect. One of the things that we saw in vaccination rates in particular, and this research was done completely pre-COVID, before the complete politicization of vaccination in the Western world, is if we look worldwide on common childhood vaccines that the WHO tracks, so like measles, all of those fun, very, very common, non-controversial childhood vaccinations. If we use foreign disinformation levels on social media as just sort of a blunt treatment effect over a 10-year period, and then control for a million different things because we're social scientists, we can see an 8 percentage point drop in those childhood vaccines on the scale of kind of the minimum to the maximum level of disinfo. That is a impossibly high level of like, that's not an 8% effect, that's 8 percentage point drop in the population. When we look at, and I'm going to tie this all back together into a central point in a second here, not just a bunch of anecdotes. If we look at the disinformation campaigns against the American elections in 2016, there was a research group, I'm blanking on, that had actually categorized all of the disinformation campaigns that the Russians were up to. And what was interesting was there was no central narrative, and they often played both sides. So it was anti-immigration was a big one, and then at the same time they were inflating gun rights groups. They were inflating pro-LGBT groups and anti-LGBT groups. Black Lives Matter groups. There was a site called blackmatters.us that was one of the largest Black Lives Matter websites on the internet. It was a Russian disinformation campaign from the ground up. Not that Black Lives Matter was, but this like central site that got posted and reposted over and over again, that all they were doing was plagiarizing content from legitimate Black Lives Matter sites and then was inflated online by Russian botnets. Pro-Texas and pro-California secessionist groups, and then my favorite, dog-loving groups. The theory there is that was the control group. So that way they could tell, you know, is there actual like effect of our botnets going on? Okay, so none of this makes any sense as a coherent narrative, right? So what's going on? The goal is not to convince at all. There is no goal in these information operations to convince anyone of a centralized narrative. You can make some broad claims of kind of anti-Western, kind of just chaotic in general, but the best way to sort of categorize it together are the goal is in and of itself to confuse. It's to create so many alternative narratives that the goal is not to convince anyone of any of them in particular, but to convince someone that they can't trust anything. And to undermine trust in the system, trust in news, trust in the very notion of truth. It's one thing we've called it is weaponized uncertainty. And if we really kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of democracy on a theoretical level, democracy relies fundamentally on the principle that we have an educated public that has informed debate over what policy should be. There's a central assumption there that there is an objective reality that we can have an argument about in the first place. If you convince everyone that it's impossible to understand what's going on in the world, you can't trust anyone giving you any information, you can't have democracy. What you can have is populism, because the kind of like the footnote there is you can't believe anyone, you can't trust anyone, what anyone is saying, so the only thing you can do is pick someone to trust. And that's me, your charismatic warlord type of thing, right? The other way to kind of look at what's going on, especially when we look at those inflating both sides of issues with increasingly incoherent and insane narratives, is a lot of us as comparative political scientists are familiar with the concept of ethnic outbidding, right? So the idea that the way that genocidal tendencies can get mainstreamed, and we saw this especially during Yugoslavia during the 80s and early 90s, is to make increasingly outlandish claims. The ethnic group that you hate is going to come and take all of your children and kill them. They're going to, the CIA is funding camps on the border to yada, yada, yada. And we've noticed that incentivizes people to get more and more insane, not because anyone believes it, but because people are terrible at assessing unlikely scenarios, right? So the idea is, I don't necessarily believe Milosevic when he says that the Muslims are coming for my children, but the implication if I'm wrong is so horrific that I don't want to take the chance. We see a very similar phenomenon when we generalize this to just extremist outbidding in general, especially on social media. So like anti-vaccination debate was like this perfect crystallization of it. Did anyone actually believe that there was like Bill Gates, Soros-funded microchips in the vaccines, or that COVID was being caused by like 5G towers, or it was a CIA project? There's few people, right? But the effect, like, and this is where like the WHO was very concerned, was not about anti-vaccination, but was about vaccine hesitancy, right? What it convinces people of is not the bad stuff's happening, but how tested has this vaccine really been? It's only been out 6 months. You know, if there's these crazy ideas out there, maybe I'll just wait 6 months for the next round of the vaccination, right? You can see like that hesitancy creep in and cause the mainstreaming of the extremist sentiment, right? And I think that's really what's going on when we see the anti-democratic weapon that's being deployed here, is if we make it so everyone is ultra hesitant of the extremist outcome being unfeasible but possible, so we need to be careful of it and trust the populist strongman, then I think a lot of the incoherence snaps into focus. I think I'm well over my 10 minutes, like I think all of us will probably do, because it's what academics do. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to my colleague here.
Thanks so much. Only a couple minutes over. We're doing well. Maria.
I need the thingy. Thank you. Okay, let me put the timer, and here we go. Well, it's great to be here. I just want to thank Aníbal, of course, and I'm just happy to be sharing with people that I'm learning a lot from, so thank you very much. This is part of a project. I work with a group of researchers, mostly, they're in Mexico, but they're mostly Cubans, and we work Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and lately we've been working the liberal influence of Russia and China in Latin America, specifically these two, mostly Cuba and Venezuela, and of course we've incorporated Nicaragua, and lately we're focusing on Mexico as well. Yes, this is a work in progress, and we are looking for funds. So we do need a lot of support because, as Oliver just said, it's very expensive. And Twitter, X, has put so many obstacles, so we're just relying on other sources. And open source investigation is great, but not enough, so yeah, I hear you. So this is something that we have, okay. So this is something we have heard about. This is not new, and the problem is that when we have, according to VDEM, we have 71% of a population is living under autocracies. There's a problem because when the developed world is having a cold, we in Latin America probably are having something worse than COVID. So it hits us really in terms of not just the stability of of our political systems, but this has an impact on our livelihoods. So there's a problem. We have 91 democracies, but we have 88 autocracies around the world. So this is something that's becoming not an outlier, it's becoming the reality for many of us. And here saying this in the US sounds really critical when even developed democracies are facing these challenges. So the illiberal influence is, of course, one of the factors in that equation of democratic backsliding. So as some of our colleagues here in the panel have said, there's a mix. of democracies underperforming, but also economic stress. And that has brought us very charismatic leaders, but also terrible leaders, because they have found a way to stay in power just being autocrats. Maybe that wasn't originally their idea, but they're turning into autocrats. And that is something they need to stay in power. It doesn't matter if it's left or right. I think the problem is that they have found a way where avoiding term limits, regardless of what the Constitution says, is something they can do because there is a permission structure. I can get rid of the Constitution. I don't like the Constitution. I'll just ignore what it says. And it works because there are no consequences. So that's where these actors, China, Russia, among others, they exploit these flaws, these weaknesses in not just political institutions, but in political leadership. So we know, not just because of VDEM, we know because there is so much literature and data on the effects, the impacts of these developments in Latin America specifically. The consecutive economic crises, because we had an economic weakness in Latin America before the pandemic, that after the pandemic, it just went worse. We have the cases in Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, how they used the pandemic to not just double down on political persecution, but the violation of human rights under the excuse or the justification of pandemic response. We're looking at the consequences right now. Those are economies that, while in some cases, like in Venezuela and Cuba, there were some minimal liberalization efforts just to keep the population attentive to that. I think the problem is that we haven't seen much advance in terms of our response from the region, okay? So we have two problems, economy and politics. And that's where the narrative is being built within that environment. We have 3 countries that we're monitoring. Of course, we have interest in Brazil, among others, but we want to learn how do these narratives that they create and introduce in social media, in literature, they have an institutional approach. They use not just soft power, they use sharp power to get into those academic environments. Debating, you go to a conference and you think you're going to listen to a presentation when it's really sowing doubts. It's what Stephen has said about democracy hesitancy. It's basically what they're doing, not just in media. And so we've been through a lot of, for example, I monitor the Russian social media on Twitter, and you have to see the engagement they have, not only with their usual partners, but for example, with Mexico, with official Twitter accounts from Mexico. That is amazing that we're not paying more attention to that, because it's right there in front of us. So we're looking at the external influence, but also the impact this influence has on personal, individual freedoms, the implications these have on civil liberties. For example, we have transnational political persecution. We have these regimes, Chinese and Russian regimes, persecuting their own nationals who live in exile. This is absolutely critical. Freedom House has data on this, and it's not something that we see usually in the media. And so there are, like I said, many other countries that we would want to look at, but there are some critical aspects, and I'll wrap it up. Military influence, yes, of course. Institutional influence, we have the Confucius Institutes. We have many ways in which they can penetrate academic environments. But nothing is more powerful than their disinformation operation through media. This is really critical. We have published several papers about it. I shared some with Aníbal. I left some printed copies, but I can give you the links to the work we do. And we're focusing both China and Russia. We know there are other ways in which these work, but the US government, this is congressional reports, they have all the information of what they're doing. This is with respect to China, but just take a look. This is Chinese social media. This is just a glimpse, a little summary of what their presence in social media. They're very active, but they're not as active and effective as Russian media. This is just so you understand how that, it's like a web of media outlets, Kremlin associated and funded, which by the way, we don't know how they fund it. And this is their organizational structure. This is how they are so effective. They're so big that you lose the sense that this comes from a Kremlin-controlled media operation. And we have outlets like Telesur in Venezuela, who basically are like a laundromat. They sanitize and legitimize everything that RT and Margarita Simonian, their operation is sanitized and legitimized through outlets like Telesur. This is a little bit of their social media presence. Take a look at those numbers. People are being basically drawn to look at these outlets as legitimate media outlets, and it's just a propaganda operation, okay? And so what we think should be done is strengthen alliances between countries that understand that democracy goes through media. And of course, we need to increase our efforts in media literacy. We designed a media, I'm sorry, okay, done. We designed, for Mexico, we designed, it's a media disinformation toolkit for NGOs in Mexico to fight against disinformation, and we thought it would be great if we could do something, you know, a little bit more general for Latin America, but that's a start. We did it because we found a grant, we got a grant from an institution, and that allowed us to do that work. But it's really very specialized, very technical. We had to bring in people, experts, who know how media works in Mexico, so we can give them the tools to fight disinformation. But this is basically something we're starting, and we need to look into more ways to reach people to understand. You know, we can't spend 2 hours with our aunt explaining her that the message she got from WhatsApp is false, right? We need something broader to reach more audiences, so we hope we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And Josh.
All right. Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah. All right, so I'm back and clean up here. Three excellent presentations. How are we doing now? Good. All right. Yeah. So anyway, to follow 3 excellent presentations, and I really appreciate the analysis here. You know, when I think of what's going on in China, you know, there's so much that relates to all of this. I mean, and especially the filling of the space, right? The filling of the space with nonsense, as long as it's causing you to redirect your attention away from the thing, right? So there's been work done where we look at, for example, the anniversary of June 4th, 1989. The Chinese internet goes crazy with bullshit, right? And then it kind of goes away because they're trying to fill this space. So what I want to do is a bit different. I've done a lot of work on China-Africa relations, and so I've looked at a lot of these same things in Africa, the role of the Communist Party, the role of the propaganda networks, and there are in Africa places like Independent Online, ironically named in South Africa, which are essentially carrying Xinhua. But what I want to do is step back and talk about this from a different perspective, which is perhaps a bit of a higher level, which is to say that our problem fundamentally begins with the nature of the regime or the governance structure in Beijing. Right? If the governance structure in Beijing, if this were a liberal democracy, however defined, we wouldn't be having these problems and sitting here today and discussing these issues, right? So I want to step back and I want to think about how the United States and Americans have looked at Chinese governance, how we're looking at it now, and then give you a bit of idea about how I think this is going in the future. So this is a bit of danger, right? I'm going to be soothsaying a bit at the very end. So maybe let me bring you back to when I entered Washington, D.C. in 2000, right? I went to GW, and then I was working in think tanks and on the Hill. And at that time, there were 3 ideas about Chinese governance that were acceptable to people, and only 3. The first was the mainstream view. China would liberalize over time. The modernization theory view. Through economic engagement and liberal engagement, university professors like myself would somehow bring China to understand that it should be a more liberal democratic place, or at least be more friendly to the United States and the West, at least, okay? So this was the mainstream view, an optimistic view shared by almost all at the time. This was the, around the WTO, China coming to WTO, this was very big. Then you had a view, a pessimistic view, and this was the view that the Communist Party of China was not long for this world. Like other communist parties, it would collapse, and then we would just pick up the pieces. Both of these views are a wait-and-see approach. Either wait and see, it'll become liberal democratic, or wait and see, it'll collapse. But either way, you don't have to do anything. The third view, which is the one I held at the time, I call the rickety house perspective, and this was that there were competing views in China, competing networks, competing interests and industries that would balance off each other, and so that China wouldn't necessarily liberalize in the way we think, but these balance of views would create a kind of rickety house effect that would allow other ideas to get into the house, like the wind. It would blow in through the cracks, and so we would be able to influence the results, even if it didn't turn out to be a liberal democracy or a complete collapse. And then the fourth view, such that there was a fourth view, was put forward by a man named James Mann in a book called The China Fantasy, where he said, no, this is going to persist and get worse. But even James Mann, who was the rightest of us all, did not predict Xi Jinping, did not predict a return to the chairman of all things. Nobody got it right. And primarily, we were too optimistic. And so we are where we are today. Now, fast forwarding to where we are today. I would say we have, again, 3 primary perspectives. The first, a mainstream view, which frankly I primarily latch onto, which is what we'd call the guardrails on the relationship. That we want to cooperate where we can, compete where we must, avoid conflict, work with our allies, the Japanese, bring the Indians on board, bring the Europeans on board, deter China in Taiwan, set red lines. This is the kind of adult talk we see from the administration, the mainstream view. Then we have what I would call a containment view, right? The first one we could call maybe constrainment, right? And the first one we could call containment, and the second one containment. And in containment, you aggressively respond to China, and you roll back China, and you are distinctively anti-CPC, and hopefully you will bring down the regime, okay? So you will hear this from a lot of people, particularly on the political right. And then the third view, which is becoming increasingly popular among academic circles, is what I would call, again, a wait-and-see approach, which is, yes, Xi Jinping is terrible. However, we don't know what comes after Xi Jinping. They could return to liberalism. So let's wait and see again, because we don't know what's next, and China, the leader, is going to, control the situation. So I would say these are your primary views that are now put out there. And an interesting phenomenon has developed in the discourse, and that is those optimistic liberalizers, those people who had been talking about modernization theory and liberalizing China through engagement. These people have adopted the third view, okay? They've adopted the view that, yes, Xi Jinping is bad, yes, he's worse than we thought, but it's temporary. And they've said this for 2 primary reasons. Okay. And the first reason is because when you have been wrong about this system, it is much easier to say, it wasn't me who was wrong about the system or the party. I was wrong about this one guy. This one guy is the problem, not my analysis. My analysis was right. In fact, it probably should have broken my way, but it didn't. The 10% happened. The small minority chance happened. Donald Trump won. It wasn't my fault as the predictor. It simply was a minority thing, and it happened. So guess what? It's just this guy. And that then explains why we don't have to look at the system, because it'll solve itself over time. They argue that there are two traditions in China, an authoritarian tradition and a liberal reform and opening up tradition. And so eventually we will just shift back. The next leader will just go back. So the reasons they put this forward are, one, pride, right? They don't want to admit that they were wrong. And second, if it's just the leader, then hope springs eternal, right? We didn't worry so much. We didn't be so concerned because, you know, those pessimists, they are overdoing it, and the fact is that it could swing the other way. So let's be hopeful, let's be optimistic. And Americans are funny. We prioritize optimism even when we shouldn't, right? We think somehow optimism is objectively better. It's not. When you're walking down the middle of the highway, you ought not be optimistic, right? But we like optimism as Americans. It's a problem. But I would say the idea that they are putting forward is almost certainly fool's gold, and I want to explain why. First, the notion that China will revert back to reform is based on the notion that China is primarily a pro-Western, not a pro-Russian place, right? And so this is very this is exactly what the Communist Party of China's propaganda would like us to believe. Nothing to see here, everything's fine. Yes, Xi Jinping's like this, but don't worry, you don't really have to respond to him because he'll go away after time. So this idea is very much in accordance with what the Communist Party of China would like us to do, which is nothing, right? Do nothing, wait and see. Continue to do that. So one reason that I think it's probably false is because it too neatly fits into what the Communist Party of China would like us to do. It also keeps those relations with those barbarian handlers alive so that they can engage these liberal optimists. They can bring them to China. They can have these conferences. They can do these things. So it allows their propaganda networks to flourish. But it's also bad history. And I want to take you back to 2012 for a moment when your graph, by the way, goes down substantially, right? Well, that's when Xi Jinping took over. And when Xi Jinping took over, there was not this, people weren't saying, well, we can't wait to have our new leader to liberalize China. No, quite the opposite. They were saying the Communist Party has been corrupt, they are rent-seeking, they are completely out of control, and we need a real leader to come in here and put them in their place. Hu Jintao was not criticized because he wasn't liberal enough. He was criticized because he wasn't strong enough, right? And it's replete. I can send you article after article at the time. So the idea that Xi Jinping or somebody like Xi Jinping is not part of the plan forgets the entire history. In fact, there was another choice to Xi Jinping, a guy named Bo Xilai. He was more pro-Western. He wasn't a liberal per se, but he was more pro-Western. He definitely had far more engagement with all types of Westerners. And what happened to him? Well, he's in jail right now, right? And he won't be getting out anytime soon. So the point is that Xi Jinping was not an aberration. He was intentional. He was part of the plan. And in order to believe that they're going to go in a different way, you have to think that, ooh, this guy's an abrogation, and he wasn't. The second is, I don't think Xi is as different from his predecessors as many people would like us to believe. I would think that Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, and Jiang Zemin would love to have the unitary power that Xi Jinping has. They just didn't get it. They were wannabes. They couldn't get it. So in their time, Deng Xiaoping struggled between liberals in his party and conservatives in his party. His going back and forth between them was not because he loved to have a debate. In fact, he would love to have, said the way it was going to be. But these important power holders, these stakeholders, were pulling him in different directions, thus making his policy quite incoherent and in many ways leading to the June 4th, 1989 crisis, right? Where those conservatives literally took the liberals out of power, and the guy who was the chairman of the Communist Party, Mr. Zhao Ziyang, was put under house arrest. So this was a tension in the party. Deng Xiaoping loathed it. Similarly, Mr. Hu Jintao and Mr. Jiang Zemin. Hu Jintao had his Youth League faction. Mr. Jiang Zemin had his Shanghai Group faction. They competed against each other. Both men would have loved to have a unitary leader, but they couldn't manage it. Xi Jinping achieved what they did not because he's so different than them, just because he was able to tame his cadres and they weren't. The third is that the techno-totalitarian state created by Hu Jintao was enhanced under Xi Jinping. Hu Jintao was not a liberal. He was arresting people every other day, all the time, constantly. Remember the blind dissident, right? There were intense crackdowns going on. What Xi Jinping did is he put this on steroids. He doubled down, he tripled down, he added money. He created a more enhanced techno-authoritarianism, but he's not fundamentally different than Hu Jintao. He's just better at it and has the technology that Hu Jintao didn't have. Finally, excuse me. Today, Chinese techno-authoritarianism is nested into every single level of society and throughout the security state apparatus, from the local township level all the way up to the president's office and in every level in between. I simply cannot sit here and say that even if the most liberal person was put in charge of China, they would be able to dismantle such a system that is nested into the guys with the guns. It seems to me the idea that a leader could simply come in and say, take down all those cameras, is laughable, hence your chuckling. And therefore, it's not going to happen. And if China remains a techno-authoritarian superstate, it cannot, by definition, become a liberal democratic society, right? So, where does that leave us? Depressed. Because finally, what is the most likely option, therefore? Well, the most likely option, in my opinion, is a Chinese Vladimir Putin. That the next person who's going to rule China is going to be some unknown apparatchik from the belly of the security state who understands how to wield this system and wield power. Somebody whose name maybe none of us know at this time. Perhaps, probably none of us know. But the idea that we are going to have a liberal Chinese state emerge is fool's gold. And because it's fool's gold, all of the issues that have been discussed here are all the more important for us, because they are not something that will go away if we just close our eyes and put our head in the sand. There's something we actually have to grapple with in the ways, and we have to fund all the projects, right, in order to understand what's going on here and be able to deal with it the best we can in a way which will be able to advance, maybe not liberal democracy, but freedom, right? Freedom and a kind of a marketplace of ideas which isn't stuffed full of all of this nonsense that you guys were talking about. So, sorry to end us on a pessimistic note, but I thought that it is what it is, as a great woman once said, right?
Thank you, Josh. Very controversial, very provocative. I hope you're wrong, but probably right. I'm sure Donald Trump will be looking to figure out who this new person is so they can become friends. Oh, I'm not supposed to be political. Okay. First of all, when does this panel end? 10:30. 10:30. Okay. Wow, you guys are efficient. Very good. I'm going to take advantage of my position, just like Anibal did yesterday, to make a comment and ask a question. So my comment as you were talking, one thing that kept coming up is the paradoxical, sometimes contradictory propagation of disinformation. I was thinking about non-governmental organizations. My favorite, which Josh will appreciate, that I fear very much, is the Falun Gong. So the Falun Gong and the Chinese Communist Party are mortal enemies, but the Falun Gong is a major supporter of the American far right and has given millions and millions and millions of dollars to far-right Republicans, including the aforementioned former President of the United States. And so here's my question, and I have questions for all of you, but I have to limit myself. So I'm going to start with Oliver. You said something I found fascinating, and also that's an important corrective for my perception of Latin America, and I'm not an expert on Latin America, and that is that Brazilians and others don't engage in debates and find debates somewhat strange about democracy versus authoritarianism. I didn't know that. Probably everybody else did, but I didn't know that. But I find this perplexing. The Latin American experience with dictatorship and democracy, the conflict, the conflict between authoritarian norms and military regimes on the same hand, and democratic norms is so extreme when compared to the United States. So I wonder, how can you explain this? Why, I mean, certainly we had Latin Americans here, such as Guillermo O'Donnell, who were concerned about democracy, who were opposed to authoritarianism, so they got it. Why don't others?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it's not that there's concern about the quality of democracy. I mean, what we've seen in Brazil over the past years was civil society and even people from across the ideological spectrum mobilizing to preserve democracy. And I think there is regional concern about what happens in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, etc. I think what I've been meaning to say is that for both governments and sort of elites, that is one factor, but not sort of not like in the United States where there's a natural way of looking at the world and it's divided between democratic regimes and non-democratic regimes. And that is because I think that there's a profound concern about foreign meddling. There's a profound nationalism that is concerned that sort of pro-democracy language may be a fig leaf for foreign interference. And that's why Brazil would not join a group of democracies, because it would somehow be threatening to the non-democracies in a way. And there's a very interesting case because and I wrote a piece for Foreign Policy about this. The Biden campaign, the Biden administration for years, for 2 years, led a concerted effort to pressure Brazilian military to respect the result of the presidential election in 2022. And I think actually it was perhaps decisive, because one of the reasons why not more Brazilian military were willing to go along with basically a movement by Bolsonaro to not recognize the result was because they would have lost access to US military equipment, which is something that Brazil's military really wants. This was quite important. But there were people, even pro-Lula, who said, this is unacceptable because they interfered in our business, basically saying we'd prefer to live in our autocracy rather than a democracy that's the result of foreign meddling in a way, right? So there's this tension, I think, between this more sort of concern about foreign influence, because some people said, well, if Biden did that, then perhaps the next president, this was a precedent, so the next president could then pressure us to go into some other directions. I think that's an important concern. Also because I think there is a lot of nuance, particularly in the Latin American experience, between semi-functional democracies, which creates a situation which this distinction, this sharp distinction, is not entirely realistic from a Latin American experience, where a lot of the regimes are partially functional, partially democratic. Sometimes we're moving into a more authoritarian direction, then it sort of moves back. But that this clear distinction, this attempt to quantify something like Freedom House does, oftentimes fails to capture kind of a more difficult and more gray zone kind of reality.
Thank you. We have a tradition at Notre Dame in the institutes of inquiring first whether there are any students in the audience who want to pose a question of the panelists.
Hi, I really appreciate it. Hi, is it working? Yes? Okay, great. Thank you so much for all of your comments today. Especially appreciated your discussion about Brazil. I spent several months there at PUC São Paulo, and I definitely heard a lot of the narratives that you were discussing today. They were very common. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about what your reading is of Lula's current foreign policy, which I think, from my perspective to a lot of American analysts, has been somewhat confusing or quote unquote unpredictable. He met with Biden about 40 days after his election, but then he also then brought a huge delegation over to China. What's your reading on whether Lula prioritizes democracy both at home but also in places in the region? I know there's been confusion about his supposed alignment with Venezuela and Cuba and other places.
So I think there is, interestingly enough, when it comes to the big issues vis-a-vis how to position Brazil, let's say, in a context of a quote-unquote new Cold War, not a big difference between Bolsonaro and Lula, actually, because there's a consensus that non-alignment or multi-alignment or equidistance or neutrality, there's lots of different names to it, is the best way forward, based on the notion, which I think is often underappreciated in the United States, that the major strategic concern in Brazil, and this is not an anti-American argument, is how to constrain and contain US influence in the region. And if Xi Jinping is available, and Putin, and Chavez, and now Maduro, and those are people which, shouldn't be at least, they shouldn't be sidelined, they should somehow be engaged, in part also because, and I was actually in favor of reestablishing formal diplomatic ties to Venezuela. We have a very long border, and we have to deal with day-to-day issues, like non-vaccinated Venezuelan cows coming into Brazil. So not having a diplomatic relationship, we must engage, so that the ministries of agriculture must talk to each other to make sure that we address these issues to avoid, disease that affects Brazilian agriculture, et cetera. So migration, drugs, there's all sorts of stuff, mining, deforestation. It's a really important partner. We may not like the government, but we must engage somehow. So I think there's a lot of pragmatism there as well. And I think democracy is not a decisive factor when Brazil crafts its foreign policy, and has actually never been. This even, and I come back to Cardoso, which I think nobody can accuse of not being a 100% Democrat. Even that guy would say, let's have Chavez actually come into Mercosur, because I think he quoted some foreign policy thinker, it's better to have Chavez inside the tent peeing out rather than the opposite, sort of constrained somehow. I don't know who said that first, but it's not Cardoso, but he used that. So I think it's super pragmatic. What Brazil considers to be non-ideological, it says the Russians are selling us, Brazil is the biggest buyer of Russian diesel. Now, you can say, is that moral? No, but somebody else, the West is also doing this or that, whatever. And it's getting fertilized. The Canadians came to Brazil and said, we can offer you fertilizer so that you don't depend on Russian fertilizer. But then the Brazilian government said, can you offer it to us at a 20% discount like the Russians do? No, Canada can't do that, right? So it's also kind of beneficial. Brazil is seeking to somehow position itself and gain from this new ultra, let's say, the return of geopolitics. And I think that it's a much more realpolitik-ish way of looking at the world than is often appreciated. And I think the same goes for India, South Africa, where just these countries look of how can they temporarily benefit from this situation.
Thank you. For more questions, be good if you identified yourselves and your institution. Yes.
Hi, we have a question from our virtual audience online. Oops, just a moment, I'm sorry. From Indiana University, what language is used in Latin America to describe the difference between democracies and autocracies, or to discuss democratic backsliding and autocratization? How does the argument that folks in Latin America don't think in these terms square with the keynote we heard last night that identifies threats to democracy, concerns about autocracy, and a willingness of opposition groups to defend democracy with their freedom and lives?
So I open this to other members as well of the panel.
That is a very good question. It depends on where people get their information, and that's part of the problem, I guess. We have a reality in Latin America, and that is we do have state media, and it depends on the health of the democracy in that country for that media to be transparent, impartial, and to do its work. But we have the circumstance in Latin America that, for example, Telesur is wide-ranging. It depends on the country. For example, right now in Argentina is not what it used to be, and I believe that is something that's being countered with extreme opposite media presence. So the problem is that it becomes such a polarizing experience. For example, in Venezuela, everything that comes through Telesur is something that people will distrust, because that's part of the strategy. And by the way, RT channels messaging and framing through Telesur to reach Latin American audiences. So once you reach something in Telesur, in RT that stays in that environment, you're going to see that Telesur is going to pick it up, and it's going to frame it in a way that it goes through Latin American audiences, and they don't connect that it comes from Telesur, from RT. It's something that Telesur is giving, it's legitimizing the information, even though it's likely to be, for example, you remember when the lab story about Ukraine labs that were, remember that? Telesur carried that as, you know, and they have partners in each country that will run that story through. So sometimes it's the frontier between information and disinformation is not clear for these audiences. However, for those who have experienced authoritarian regimes, they know what's at stake, and they know that democracy is a way out. The problem is that we are being confronted by different tiers of disinformation, that what they try to do is undermine democracy, like Stephen said. They're not looking for people to change their minds about democracy. What they're looking for is to sow enough doubt to distrust institutions, elections. Why am I going to vote? They're going to ignore my vote, so it doesn't matter. I won't participate. So there is a clear conscience about what autocracies are. But just look at El Salvador. What did people do because democracy is not delivering? I'm going to trust this guy who is going. Same happened with Fujimori. We're just repeating the pattern. We know what autocracies are. Look at Latino Barometro's numbers. People are willing to give autocrats a chance because democracy is not delivering, but they know what they're getting into. What they don't know is that they won't get out of it anytime soon. I hope that helps.
That's great.
Just a quick interjection here. You know, I think it was Oliver who talked about how the language of democracy versus autocracy doesn't resonate in Latin America. And I think that represents the success of this muddying the waters. Yeah. That these guys have so co-opted the language of democracy, have so abused the language of democracy, that they have caused it to become meaningless to many people around the world. And we've talked quite a bit about how they do that, but I think that represents a kind of a success, if you will. And so my response, and maybe this is where I might disagree with Oliver, a little tension here, my response would not be to give up on the language of democracy, it would be to recapture it, to rebrand it, and to make it mean something again. Because if you give over the language of democracy, the language of rights, to the autocrat, you'll never get it back again, and it will be polluted forever. So my response might be to say we need to fight harder to identify the value of democracy, to kind of have a renaissance of this as we had in the 90s. And if we can do that, then that's the way to stop this kind of, well, what does democracy mean to me anyway, kind of response. But I don't know if you would agree with that.
If I may, just very briefly, I'm not against tension, but I agree with you on this one. I think one of the ways to, let's say, rebrand is to talk about very specific things, because I think the language, the abstract language of democracy may not resonate, but very specific things about what that means, about having a free, unrestrained public debate, minority rights, free media, etc., all the things that come with the possibility to change your government. All that, I think, is more tangible than, let's say, from a non-Western, non-American audience, abstract-sounding language about sort of freedom and democracy, which I personally agree with, but which I see often being absorbed or being listened to in a very sort of cynic way of saying, well, you know, what the United States did in the name of democracy, and then listing all the, you know, the things where, let's say, you know, Iraq and all these things. So where this gets also mixed up with anti-American sentiment, where talking specifics, I think, goes a very long way, because that's where you have a huge overlap in interests between Latin America and, you know, the United States and Europe, is how democracy has an impact on day-to-day lives. So I agree with you to some extent that also the cynicism vis-a-vis democracy may be actually part of these disinformation campaigns. Absolutely.
Stephen?
Yeah.
You're good.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question.
You showed very, very impressively all the disinformation that is being spread there. You showed very impressively all the disinformation that's being spread here. What I wonder is, do you also have clear evidence of the impact, the effective causal impact on people? How many people buy into this? How much does it change their views? Because, I mean, media studies have for decades struggled with the problem that people select the information they consume. And so do you actually, you know, what difference does it actually make? I mean, if we see something about some crazy thing, we just say, poof, forget it, right? So what is the effective impact, especially when you think about foreign policy? I mean, the Brazilian Itamaraty, I don't think they care very much what the broader public thinks. And that attitude that you described, this pragmatism, that I'm not worried about ideals, I want to do what is best for Brazil's national interest and I cooperate with anybody, that has been around for decades. That's not new, right? And so what is the effective impact, the causal effect of all that disinformation? Do you have clear evidence on that?
Well, I think the vaccine graph that I showed was a pretty specific one of a very direct causal impact that we could tease out there. We have some additional work. I didn't show a graph of it where using disinformation as sort of a treatment effect on level of democracy in countries, we can see a very similar effect happening. We're still working on getting that one published. But I think that we've seen a very, very specific causal effect of undermining trust in institutions, undermining trust in experts, undermining trust in the very ability to believe in anything or believe that anything's true. There was one really fantastic study that came out of NYU's social media lab where they did one of those very resource-intensive, gargantuan panel studies of like 30,000 people, trying to like tease out how good are people at figuring out if they're being lied to online, whether can they identify disinformation. And what they wanted was to figure out, okay, how can we prevent this, right? Because we have like, media literacy campaigns, all of these bright ideas, and it was dejecting the story you got out of it because none of the variables that we as social scientists would value mattered. It wasn't education. It wasn't, more educated people are better at it. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't any of the covariates. The only covariate that mattered was age, in that if you were older, you were worse at it. If you were younger, you were better at it because you grew up in a world like this. And one of like the temptations is, oh wait, actually this is good news in the long run because we just have to wait for all the old people to die. Like, wait for our generation to go and whoop, problem solved. But the bad news side of it was that, well, the youths are good at it because they don't believe in truth. Like, they just don't believe that you can know. It's all lies and it's all disinformation. So that's sort of the very bad news side of things. But one thing that I would point back to on what you said is, in the question of this kind of stuff has been going on for decades. And this is one thing I really like to point to, especially as someone that studies Russia so much, is this shouldn't be a surprise that Russia discovered disinformation on the internet, because nothing they're doing isn't part of the old Soviet KGB playbook of trying to, spread in third world newspapers that AIDS was engineered by the CIA and all of these almost urban mythologies at this point. And one of the things that's really interesting to look at is, while social media has given new life to decades and even centuries old kind of Russian perspective on anti-Westernism, put us forth as an alternative to global capitalism that everyone's falling behind on, is that one of our lessons from that is the people of, normal people, whether it's people of the developed world or the developing world, have a tendency to screw up those long-term superpower plans. So very famously, the Soviets like to say the world's going our way during the Soviet era. And they point to all of the successes in both the disinformation and the active campaigns of like providing military aid and such that, oh yeah, all of sub-Saharan Africa and all of Latin America is going communist. And the reality was, there was no actual real spread of communist ideology. They were just happy to take Soviet money. And as soon as there was a divergence of whether this is working for us or not, communism went out the window, just like, yay, Americanism went out the window. So I think that there's sort of a, if we take a step back, I can like at least the long-term historical good news is more the social media is new and different and online disinformation is new and different. But superpowers trying to do this is as old as day, and this is simply a new phenomenon.
Yes, let's go over time, a couple of minutes, if I may. Well, I control the panel, so let's go over time. Let's take two questions, these two questions, and let's put them together, and please be short.
Thank you. I really appreciate comments from panel members. I'm not a political scientist, but I remember Professor Huntington remarked, you cannot have sustainable democracy unless country has a strong foundation of middle class. And I agree that unless a country solve the economic problem, eliminate poverty, and you have a sufficient foundation of middle class, it's my opinion, sustainable democracy is not possible. So I wonder your opinion, whether you agree with Huntington's remark. When I look at every country in the country, you need to have a strong foundation of a middle class backing the democracy. When your country is poverty-stricken, democracy is not sustainable. That's my hypothesis.
And
Thank you. I have a question for Steven. That's very interesting data. It's very creative to try to kind of map this globally. My main question is, you're asking coders a double-barrel question, right? Is there fake news, and is it coming from abroad and specifically from certain countries? I mean, can you distinguish that? I mean, you probably give them guidelines, such as BDM does, right? But I would think that for a coder, it's easier to tell that there is fake news than to identify the source. So, I mean, like María Isabel gave you an example of how, foreign influence, goes through other channels that aren't predictable. So I'm not sure where your data is showing just fake news. And if that's the case, then it's not surprising that it's inconsistent, because there is no central plan, right? Some people come from the left, some from the right, so you will see contradictory. A plan shouldn't exist if there is no. Maybe from China, yes, because it's centralized, but from our countries.
okay, so let's go down the line here and respond to either or both questions.
So very, very quickly, I think a strong middle class certainly helps, but the Latin American experience shows that I think Brazil has no strong middle class in the sort of American sense, but its democracy has actually been a great success story despite ups and downs. And I think that I'm personally beginning to think about threats to democracy being somewhat disconnected from economic issues, because a lot of the democracies that are facing threats are doing quite well economically. And it's a bit of a mystery to me. I mean, economic growth in Hungary is one of the big success stories in Europe, and yet it's facing this profound threat. India first election back in the 40s, vast majority of the population illiterate, very committed to democracy, poverty-stricken for decades, fairly functional democracy, now is doing great economically, at least, I mean, still facing lots of difficulties, but certainly better than the past decades, and yet it's facing its biggest threat to democracy now, not at a time of economic crisis, but one where it's about to become a great economic power, right? Overtaking Japan as the world's fourth largest democracy. So there's something there that I think goes beyond sort of middle-class economic issues, but certainly is a helpful thing. Regarding the sources, and just a very quick also what Kurt said about measuring the impact, the big problem for us now is that people no longer use only Facebook or even X, where you can at least purchase the data. It's Facebook, Telegram, and these are highly fragmented, closed groups. And understanding, and this is, I think, what Maria showed us about RT and the impact. I mean, that's just sort of would be the best case scenario if it only were these institutions. I mean, what Stephen has shown us. I mean, there's a whole world of fake news going on, which we just cannot access unless we have massive manpower and putting all these people into these groups to monitor. And regarding final comment, that the sources, of course, there is a centralized, perhaps, attempt by China and the and Russia, but at least the case of Brazil shows us the United States have been a source of fake news that has undermined democracy in Brazil. Where sometimes I used to sort of watch things that are circulating on American media, Tucker Carlson video saying that the U.S. elections, that the last U.S. elections were stolen. And now the same thing is happening to Brazil, where Bolsonaro is clearly very popular, but somehow there's dark forces at hand which will lead to an election loss of Bolsonaro. This is a case of the United States being the source of fake news undermining democracy also, which makes the whole discussion even more convoluted, that there may be anti-democratic forces within Western democracies undermining other democracies. And that's something I think we shouldn't overlook either. Thank you.
Stephen.
Yeah, and I'll just talk real quick about our methodology there. So I skimmed over it in the presentation, of course, abbreviated for time. So we asked it as a several part question. It's a Likert scale question. So instead of just saying, hey, on a scale of 0 to 4, something, something, and one person's 4 is another person's 3, they're anchored in the sense of like 3 is defined as this, 4 is defined as this. And we ask it in terms of sort of almost a 2x2 sort of thing that political scientists love so much, in terms of in several parts asking, okay, what is the level of disinformation on social media? And we word it very, very particularly. We very intentionally don't use the term fake news because it's so loaded, like in the question. Asking domestic sourced, like on social media in this country coming from the government, on social media coming from foreign governments, and then also how much does the government use it abroad? And then we don't do the final one because it doesn't actually make sense. If they answer, if the coder answers that, yes, there is foreign source disinformation above a minimal level on social media in the country, cool. Follow-up question. Which countries do it? Here's a drop-down of all the countries in the world. Pick, okay, Russia does it. Now answer the 0 to 4 question just for what Russia's doing in this country. Now, like, so we have this implicit that implicitly you're answering for all 180-ish or whatever countries. What is the level of Angolan-sourced disinformation on American social media and so on and so on, but most of it's implicit because if they don't pick it from the drop-down, it's implied as a 0 or a 4. So that's how we're getting at that, is we're asking them just first of all, what's the level? And that was sort of the map I was showing you, was just the general level of disinformation from foreign sources online. But then we do it dyadically also. The dyadic data is not available yet. That's the one we're working on right now. I literally got the spreadsheet for it yesterday from our methods guy. And I would also like to point out I focused in on what's Russia and China doing basically, but democracies are not innocent on this. The level of countries where, yes, it's the United States doing the disinformation in a particular country is very high. Like, not to the degree of Russia, because this is like Russia's tool, that they have really been entrepreneurial about. But Western countries do it as well. Like for instance, anecdotally, the first round of data that we did this for, when we're just looking at the very first face validity tests of, is our data noise or are we actually getting stuff? One of the things that spiked was the Central African Republic getting hit with disinformation campaigns. And our initial response being, I'm a Russianist, I know Central African Republic's in the center of Africa because it's called that, was great, our data's screwed up. Because why in the world would Central African Republic be spiking? We go digging and it's the Russians and it's the French. The Russians and the French had a dueling disinformation operation for several years in the Central African Republic. Just to go on that bit there about how it's not just the dictatorships doing things. And we get a lot of these especially interesting regional relationships where the North Koreans being active hitting South Korea, India and Pakistan hitting each other, the Saudis hitting basically any country that has Muslim minorities in it. And so there's a lot of really interesting relationships that are going on that way.
Maria.
I want to comment on something that I guess is part of the bigger conversation, and that's the fact that we have now, in this disinformation environment, challenging democracies around the world, what we have is this unique liaison between left and right, because it's not an ideological, the liberal influence is not really ideological, and then you have leftists and people on the right, extreme both, who are having the same kind of messaging towards Ukraine or the Israel-Gaza war. And what is bringing these people together? Well, it depends. Oliver says something that is critical. What's happening here in the US is part of the conversation we need to have, because it's spilling over what Latin American democracies or even West European democracies are facing. We have people disaffected. We have people who feel that democracy has let them down. Democracy has not delivered. But you also have different regional reasons for that. America is going through demographic anxiety. It's not the case for Central America. It's not the case for South America. But the problem is that it doesn't matter what the origin of the dissatisfaction is. The fact that you have people in, I think the Latino Barometro numbers are so worrisome, because people favor authoritarian expressions so they can achieve what they think democracy has not been capable of providing. It's not just safety. It's also that some groups in some of these countries feel that that's the only way for them to be achievers. So we can't paint a picture that is, uniform for everyone. But the fact that we have these numbers telling us that it doesn't matter if you're on the extreme or just left and the extreme or just right, you find it, reasonable to have a position where you can support someone like Bolsonaro or someone like Bukele, or on the other side, someone like Petro or someone like, I don't know. That's what we're dealing with. And these fake narratives are becoming the reality, not fake, the framing, the messaging becomes the reality for these people. And if they're watching them, not just through Telesur, there are many associates, and they don't know where that comes from. And just to close, there was a piece that I worked on about the Ukrainian conflict. It was in Telesur, and it had a link to a Telegram channel, the Russian defense Telegram channel, for people to keep updated. And that's going through Telesur. So there you have it. That's just one tiny note on many, many other things that we have detected.
Thank you, and Josh.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing between the two comments here. One the union of the left and the right with regard to this, and the fact that anti-Semitism figures so highly in this, I have to say, it has never been a scarier time to be a Jew in America. You all should know that right now. You have no, for the reasons we've discussed. But I want to go back to a comment this gentleman made. I just want to speak specifically to the impact of this. And so I've done a lot of work on China, Africa, and in many ways, Africa is the testing ground for Chinese influence in the global south. So what you see in Africa, you will see later in Latin America if it's working, right? So Africa is that kind of lost leader in that way. And so what have we seen? Well, I can tell you within the last decade, no African country has pushed back on any issue that China calls its core interests. Not Taiwan, not Tibet, South China Sea. In fact, quite the opposite. You got countries like Rwanda saying, we support China in the South China Sea. This landlocked, small African country. Why do they say that, right? Because the Chinese are their friends and they ask them to. So I would say that is a demonstration of the impact in terms of elite impact. Now, if we look at different, but the populace, we have two guidestones here. One is the Pew data and one is Afrobarometer, and they give us different results. Pew seems to suggest that it's working, that in the 3 countries that Pew looks at, South Africa, I think it's Nigeria and Kenya, China is actually on the upswing. But Afrobarometer suggests quite the opposite, right? That China is down 15% on the 36 country average. So it's very hard for us to kind of understand the impact at the grassroots level of this. But I can tell you that the Chinese have just they just built the Julius Nyerere School in Tanzania, where the Communist Party of China is training African political parties in their style of governance, right? And if that works, I promise you, you will see it around the world. So I can't speak specifically at the grassroots level. As I said, that's hard. We have conflicting information. But in terms of elites and in terms of ensuring core national interests, I would say it's been extremely successful in Africa, and then we can look forward in other regions as well.
Wow, what a fantastic, provocative panel. And also a great start to our conference. Thanks you all for coming.